Okay. Okay, so people are joining. Give it a minute. Okay. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. My name is Arez Kidayski. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Tonight we have with us Ambassador Daniel Fried and Dr. Alexandra Lanoszka, who I will introduce in due course. We will be talking today about the upcoming NATO summit, which is starting tomorrow, and NATO's support for Ukraine and what Canada can and should be doing both in the context of NATO and in support for Ukraine. So just to a bit of housekeeping for anyone who has questions, please write them into the Q&A or the chat, and I will, after our speakers speak, I will compile questions and pose them to our speakers after their remarks. But in order to open our evening, I'd like to introduce Alexandra Chyczij, who is the national president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, in which role she has served since 2018. Previously, she was vice president of the UCC and has been a committed leader, activist, and volunteer in our community for many years. She is the executive director of the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association, the national voice of in-house counsel in Canada. Prior to that, she was the executive director of the Advocates Society, the national not-for-profit association for trial lawyers, judges, and advocates, and previously practiced civil litigation. I think almost everyone on the call knows Alexandra, and I would like to please ask her to open our evening, some opening remarks.
Thank you, Otis. So as Otis said, on the eve of the Washington NATO Summit, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress welcomes our speakers and participants to this evening's discussion on Ukraine, Canada, and NATO. As it turns out, this evening's discussion is more timely than ever. I spent some time yesterday thinking about how I would open the discussion today, and then upon hearing this morning's news of the brutal attacks on Ukraine's hospitals and maternity wards, I tore up those notes. At last count, there were 41 fatalities and 170 injured, and survivors are still being looked for. So before we begin our discussion, I would like to ask everyone to pause for a brief moment of silence in remembrance of the innocent victims of today's attacks. Thank you, and Vichnaya Pamyat, may their memory be eternal. So this morning's attack has shown once again what the cost of this war is in human lives, and the consequence of Western and allied delay in providing Ukraine with what it needs. At stake is the very survival of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian state, which Russia seeks to destroy and to subjugate. And it's a particularly squalid type of evil that attacks children who are already facing illness, and that attacks hospitals and maternity wards. And it's that evil against which Ukraine is forced to fight, and that evil which the West, collectively speaking, continues to tolerate, and by doing so encourages or permits the commission of more war crimes, more death, and more destruction. It should have been clear long ago that the only option is for Russia to be defeated militarily, but there are those who still believe that Russia can be mollified or appeased or deterred or negotiated with. And as Ambassador Fried, as you said earlier today, if I may, that those eager to push negotiations on Putin's terms will probably continue to do so. But realism, a realistic view of this war requires a clear-eyed view of, first of all, Russia's objectives, which is the destruction of Ukrainian independence and nationhood, and of course of Russia's means, which includes the mass killing of civilians. What realism is not is entertaining fatuous hopes for Kremlin's moderation. And Ambassador Fried, we look forward to hearing more on that. So although Ukraine has defended the freedom of Europe for almost 3 years, Ukraine still does not have the weapons, ammunition, or aid that it needs to push Russian soldiers off of its territory and to liberate the occupied territories. So, and as the NATO Leaders Summit starts tomorrow in Washington, if media reports are correct, it appears that once again, Ukraine will not be offered a concrete timeline for membership. World leaders speak of bridges, even well-lit bridges, fear of Article 5, lack of readiness on the part of Ukraine, and so on. And all will express their deep concern, but as President Zelensky said today, compassion is not a weapon. It remains our hope that a path to membership will be offered to Ukraine, and that perhaps today's events will be the catalyst to move the West forward in the right direction. Because if the deliberate murder of innocent children is not enough to mobilize the West, I hesitate to ask what is. And indeed, where is that elusive red line for the West? Outside of offering Ukraine membership, there are many things that NATO allies could and should be doing to hasten Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat. We will be discussing these and other issues today. So thank you to our speakers, Ambassador Fried and Professor Lanoszka, for offering your timely analysis today. And thank you to everyone for joining our conversation.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. It is an honor for me to introduce our next speaker, Ambassador Daniel Fried. He is currently the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and serves on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy and is a visiting professor at Warsaw University. During his 40-year foreign service career, Ambassador Fried played a key role in designating and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As Special Assistant and NSC Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, Ambassador to Poland, and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe from 2005 to 2009, Ambassador Fried helped craft the policy of NATO enlargement to Central European nations and in parallel NATO-Russia relations, thus advancing the goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Ambassador Fried, please, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Alexandra Chyczij summed up the situation rather well. Russia's attack on the Children's Hospital shows again that they are fighting a war of national extermination. They want to destroy the Ukrainian nation as an independent nation and reduce the inhabitants of Ukraine to the status of slightly inferior Russians, whose national identity as Ukrainians is to be stamped out as thoroughly as Stalin tried to stamp it out, and actually, I think, with greater brutality, if the Russians actually succeed in conquering all of Ukraine. It is unlikely that they will succeed. I don't know how the war will end, but it will almost certainly not end with a Russian victory parade down the Khreshchatyk in Kyiv. We don't know, as I said, how it will end, but we are on new territory at this point. The war has gone on for 2 years, and Putin is counting on a collapse of Western will or a change of the political climate in at least one major Western country, the United States, to give him the political means he needs to win a war that he cannot win, it seems, on the battlefield. Ukraine and NATO's defense against Russian aggression will be the chief topics at the NATO summit. There will also be at the NATO summit a discussion of what Europe can do in Asia, because in the United States, the problem of a rising and aggressive China is a paramount problem. There will be extensive discussion of Ukraine. There will be some advance in the NATO-Ukraine relationship, and I don't knock a bridge to NATO, and I'll get into that a little bit later. It is not enough to suit the Ukrainians, and arguably it is we could be doing more right now, but it is a serious step. As I said, I'll get into that a little later. The NATO summit will also take place against the backdrop of a general debate in the United States about our security posture. The Trump world has become associated with a sort of neo-isolationism. And the America First movement of today does recall the America First movement of the late 1930s up until Pearl Harbor, which was, the record shows, indifferent to European security, skeptical about this ability of France and Britain to resist Hitler, and in many ways sympathetic to Nazism. That is a record. That is the historical record of the original First movement, and there are many in the current America First movement who show an inexplicable ideological sympathy for Putin and Putinism. That does not mean that everyone in Trump world is ready to accept Putin's terms for Ukraine. There is a debate, and you can feel it even inside Trump world. But the NATO summit is taking place against the backdrop of this American debate. And there is a view that Ukraine is a strategic liability to the United States. The sooner we are shed of it, the better. And that European security should be carried out by the Europeans, who are not spending enough on defense and ought to be squeezed into doing more, with the threat of American withdrawal from Europe a goad, a stick with which to hit them to get them to spend more. Now, I put this in stark terms, but former President Trump's language is scarcely less blunt than what I've just laid out. That is the backdrop of the NATO summit. The Biden administration believes that the fight for Ukraine is part of the fight for the free world. Now, many people listening to this would probably be critical of the slow pace of various American decisions to provide various sophisticated weapon systems to Ukraine, and I would probably share all of those concerns. The Biden administration, however, should be seen as a vast improvement over the Obama administration, which refused to send any weapons to Ukraine under the curious logic that Russia had escalation dominance, and it didn't matter how many weapons we send, they would lose. The Trump administration broke that barrier, sent some weapons, but not many, and with a lot of restrictions. They did not send serious weapons. The Biden administration, in the run-up to the war, made two judgments. One, they accurately determined that Russia was going to attack. They were spot on, dead right, and they were insistent that this was going to happen. They didn't hedge their bets, but they also made an assessment that Russia would most likely win the war quickly. That was wrong, but because of that assumption, they hesitated to provide weapons to Ukraine before the war, partly on the grounds that it would seem that we were arming or trying to stimulate the conflict, but also because they thought it would be futile and the weapons we sent would soon end up in Russian hands. Now, happily, they were wrong. But by underestimating the ability of the Ukrainian military to resist the initial parts of the full-scale invasion, they may have squandered an opportunity for the Ukrainians to push the Russians back even further. Now, where are we at the moment? The Americans have sent serious weapons, F-16 fighters, HIMARS, ATACMS, longer-range ATACMS. Each decision has taken too long. There's still too many restrictions. But let's also remember how much the U.S. has done. It's been a lot. The U.S. has hardly been alone. Various European countries, the Poles, the Czechs, the Balts, have done a tremendous amount. So have the Germans, although they have hesitated with respect to some of the sophisticated weapons, even more than the United States. Still, the Europeans have done a lot to shoulder the burden. So where are we today and what do we do about it? I don't know how the war will end. I really don't know. I don't think Ukrainian victory is assured, but neither is Russian victory. People who make certain predictions that the war cannot be won by Ukraine, or that the Ukrainians are inevitably going to win the war if only we will help them sufficiently. Those arguments don't carry it for me. The battlefield is in the balance. The front line on the ground seems stalemated. The Russian strategic attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure are hurting the Ukrainian electricity network, and there are rolling blackouts in Ukrainian cities. This counts as a Russian success so far, and it may be attenuated by the provision of more and more anti-aircraft and air defense weapons. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have enjoyed significant strategic success going after Russian military installations in Crimea, and they have forced the Black Sea Fleet out of the Black Sea. This is a major success by the Ukrainians, and they are also going after the Russian communications lines, supplying their forces in the southwest salient of the greatest Russian advance. In short, there are pluses and minuses for the Ukrainians. I don't know how the war will end. If I don't know how the war will end, that suggests that the United States and Europe can affect its outcome. We can, in fact, move the needle by providing Ukraine the weapons it needs. We need to do so, and we need to do so with fewer caveats and more dispatch. We also need to put more economic pressure on Russia using sanctions and intensifying export controls. Sanctions by themselves won't save Ukraine, but they can severely damage the Russian economy. They're not working at the speed we would all like. That doesn't mean they're not working. And if you read the economic studies or you listen to some of the Russian officials speaking candidly, they're acknowledging the hurt. The means for a relative Ukrainian success are there. So we need to put our backs into it. The NATO summit can help. Now, the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine is going to be one of the themes at the NATO summit. It's not an easy matter to invite Ukraine into NATO. There's a war on. I was involved in the initial policy decisions having to do with NATO enlargement to Poland and later to the Baltic states. Those were tough calls, but they were easy compared to the situation we're in now. Because the situation we're in now is a country with an active conflict, a full-scale war. Alexandra Chyczij made the valid point that we should be doing more. Well, fair enough. But we've moved a lot. A year ago, in the run-up to the Vilnius summit, the Biden administration didn't want to talk about NATO enlargement at all. When I wrote a piece advocating serious consideration of Ukrainian accession to NATO. I got a short, snippy email back from the NSC saying, Dan, do you realize that if Ukraine were in NATO, we'd be at war with Russia? Full stop. That was the entire email. They didn't want to talk about it then. A year later, the Biden people are talking about a bridge to NATO. Now, I have some familiarity with the way American administrations organize themselves to make big decisions. In my experience, when an administration decides on a slogan, that slogan may not be perfect. I mean, you could knock it. You could say it's a bridge to nowhere. What does a bridge mean? Why this? Why that? Okay, I get it. But a bridge to NATO as a metaphor can be a framework for a policy into which and under which can be stuffed all manner of good initiatives. It gives cover for people in the administration who want to do more for Ukraine in the security field by calling it part of the bridge to NATO. I'm not saying it's enough. I'm saying it is something with which we can work. I don't see how Ukraine security and how European security can be assured in the long term with Ukraine in a gray zone. I don't see it. We tried Ukrainian neutrality. We tried in the run-up to the war, even promising Putin, this is what the German chancellor did. He even promised Putin that Germany would maintain its veto against any moves by Ukraine toward NATO membership, if only Putin wouldn't attack. Putin attacked anyway. That deal ought to be off the table because as I said, I don't see how long-term European security can be assured with Ukraine in a gray zone. 30 years ago, Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel warned President Clinton that if you Americans don't open the doors to NATO while you have the opportunity, the Russians will be back. They will be trying to reconstitute the empire, and there will be a war. So don't be fools. The war that they warned Clinton about 30 years ago is the war that we've got in Ukraine right now. And we need to take this seriously. We can succeed. I believe that the defense of Ukraine by NATO is actually more practical than I thought it would be, than I thought it was 5 years ago. Because Ukraine has very nearly done the job without anything from NATO other than the weapons. If there had been US air power covering Ukraine, this war would have been over very quickly. It is no light matter to bring Ukraine into NATO. And I don't want to be blithe or critical of the Biden administration's hesitation because they have to consider the consequences and consider them well. But I hope that the NATO summit does advance Ukraine's membership in NATO, not because I'm a NATO fetishist, but because European security requires that that a gray zone, which is to Putin a green light, be closed. Now, Orest, I've gone on much too long, and for that, my apologies. But Pani Alexandra inspired me to go on at length, and so I will shut up now and be happy to answer questions later.
Well, Ambassador Fried, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we are more than happy to listen to you for as long as you like to speak, and certainly thank you for your very interesting and very thoughtful remarks. And I would like to turn to Dr. Alexandra Lanoszka, who is the Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Waterloo, where he studies alliance politics, theories of war, and European security. His first book was Atomic Assurance: The Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation in 2018, and his second book was Military Alliances in the 21st Century in 2022. He has co-written policy monographs on Baltic regional security and Taiwan's defense posture as well as co-edited a volume on NATO's enhanced forward presence. He sits on the editorial board of the journal Contemporary Security Policy and is the Ernest Bevin Associate Fellow in Euro-Atlantic Geopolitics at the UK-based think tank Council on Geostrategy. Dr. Lanoszka, please welcome back. You're a frequent guest on UCC webinars, and we are always glad to have you. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me back. I wish the circumstances would be a lot better indeed. I know it's not much, but your community certainly has my sympathies and my condolences as regards to the act of evil that was visited upon Kyiv earlier today. You asked me to focus my remarks on what Canada could do or what Canada has been doing in the context of the NATO summit tomorrow. Unfortunately, I think decades of underinvestment has left Canada in a position where it cannot do too much. Canada has been a leader of sorts as regards to its support for Ukraine. It has a deep pocketbook and has used it accordingly to provide financial as well as humanitarian assistance. Its record on providing military assistance is, however, a very spotty one. Ambassador Freed talked about the record of the Biden administration in the run-up to the actual full-scale invasion, the 24th of February. The Canadian record is not that positive. There was already statements emanating from Ottawa to the effect that Ukraine was locked in some battle between democracy and autocracy with Russia. However, despite casting the conflict in such terms, Canada did not provide lethal assistance just prior to the full-scale invasion, in part because of concerns about so-called escalation risks. Canada did provide military assistance and has given rather significant military hardware, at least as far as Canada is concerned, to Ukraine since the 24th of February. However, precisely because it has neglected those capabilities for many, many years under multiple prime ministers of different political parties, Canada simply found itself in a position where it cannot really do too much. There have been calls to increase ammunition production. Some have pegged the amount necessary for that production to be about 400 million Canadian dollars. Unfortunately, the Canadian government balked at that price tag, citing it as being too heavy. Alas, the Canadian government has decided to spend far more significant amounts of cash on electronic vehicles. And so it does not appear that this Canadian government is that interested in providing the necessary investment in the Canadian defense sector. That's not to say that there's nothing absolutely happening in this portfolio. However, it does appear that Canada has been uncomfortable with providing the needed investment, that the Canadian government still remains rather naive about international affairs, despite being in power since 2015 under the current Liberal government, that Canada represents one of a handful of NATO countries not to have expelled any any Russian so-called diplomats from the Russian embassy. It's one of the very few, if not the only country within the alliance to, in fact, cut defense spending in the context of what's been happening since 2022. That matters precisely because, at least in my own research that I've conducted with Jordan Becker at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, the most significant predictor of a country giving military assistance to Ukraine has been its defense budget, namely its operations and maintenance. In other words, if a country is strategically prepared by way of training its forces and stocking its forces, it would have the wherewithal to provide military assistance. Hence, those countries along the eastern flank of NATO have given fairly significant amounts of military assistance. Hence, the United States and the United Kingdom have done something similar. Canada has been falling behind as such. And I'm worried that because military power takes a long time to develop in the current technological environment, we have created for ourselves a very significant challenge that will take years, if not decades, to repair. I'm sad to say, I do not think that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the part of Russia has galvanized the Canadian government to take those first necessary steps. The defense policy update released earlier this spring only promises large investments that would come after 2025, meaning after the next federal election that is due to happen constitutionally, and as such, it represents an unserious document. So with respect to the NATO summit, Canada, of course, will support Ukrainian membership. One can be cynical and say that it does so precisely because it knows that it's not going to go very far because of opposition coming from particular NATO countries, namely Hungary, but one can also think of Slovakia, perhaps Turkey as well. And I suspect, as a number of media reports have indicated in recent days, including today, that Canada may indeed become the subject of a lot of criticism on the part of allies, precisely because of the defense spending issues that I had mentioned earlier. So Canada still has a lot of clout. I don't want to dismiss Canada altogether, but it has, again, put itself in a position where it should do more, but it cannot do more because it has constrained itself given the years of inattentiveness to its own security situation.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lanoszka, for those thoughtful and timely remarks. I will remind everyone who's joined us, who's listening, that you can type in questions to the Q&A, and we have about 25 minutes to address some questions. We've already received some, so I will start basically just kind of compiling them and asking them in sort of a paraphrased way. So the first question is about different models of NATO, prospective NATO membership. So the feasibility of either a Norwegian or a West German model for Ukrainian NATO membership, which means basically different limitations on NATO membership and to what extent and where an Article 5 guarantee would extend, and whether or not that is something A, being looked at, and B, if it is being looked at, is it a feasible road or is it a unrealistic option? So I don't know who wants to go first. Either of our guests, please.
I'll give it a try. The West German, to remind people, when West Germany joined NATO in 1955, it had a major territorial issue, a major territorial dispute called East Germany. The then Chancellor Konrad Adenauer made a declaration in which basically said that West Germany is joining NATO, and without prejudice to our claim to all of Germany, that Germany should not be divided. For the purposes of NATO and defense, it's only West Germany which is joining the alliance. That has some utility for Ukraine because it is conceivable that if there were a kind of de facto armistice without Russia being driven out of all of Ukraine, that unoccupied Ukraine could join the alliance, and Article 5 would only pertain to that part of Ukraine which was not under Russian occupation. Now, I'm not saying we're close to that, but I can tell you that governments in Western Europe and the Biden administration are very much aware of this precedent. And there's another precedent which is at least worth considering. South Korea ended the war but not through a general settlement, but through a temporary armistice. It's still at war with North Korea. That war never ended. But the peace is maintained by a security guarantee, even though the North Korean, the demilitarized line, the demarcation line in South Korea has never been completely peaceful. Now, in both cases, you had US and other troops enforcing the peace. And the question is how much the US and Europe are willing to invest in Ukraine to enforce a peace. Right now, that question is not going to be answered at the NATO summit, not this time. But it is something that we have to consider because various solutions for the problem of how to defend Ukraine and avoid repeat wars have to be considered. And these are issues that the Biden administration and other governments are thinking about internally, even though they're not talking about it a lot. I don't have an answer, but I do know that we need to think about this. And I and some of my colleagues are doing some of that thinking.
I suppose the larger point I would make here is maybe to think more on the immediate terms, on the immediate goal of finishing the war on as favorable of an outcome as possible. I worry sometimes the conversation about NATO membership can distract us from that goal. I worry because it's not just the United States that currently has hangups about Ukraine joining NATO. I mentioned other countries, Slovakia and Hungary being two of them. And indeed, Sweden and Finland had to endure a fairly protracted accession process, and they don't have a hot war with Russia. And indeed, they're members of the European Union and check all sorts of boxes already. I think there is a deeper problem amongst Western capitals, and that is a problem of strategic drift. There is no clear strategy for winning the war on terms as favorable as they can be for Ukraine. I think that's the real problem. And I'd rather see the conversation focus more on trying to develop and trying to equip such a war-winning strategy. My sense is that there is no strategy, not in Washington, and not in other capitals. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think issues of NATO membership are rather moot, in part because Ukraine finds itself in a sad paradox where, in order to join a military alliance that serves really to deter Russia, Ukraine has to defeat Russia on the battlefield first. And until it does that, the membership question will always be fraught with various difficulties. So the conversation as such should turn on what can Ukraine do to minimize costs and try to maximize the chances of victory.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, we've had a few about the Budapest Memorandum and the implications therein. So basically, in 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for assurances or guarantees, depending on who you ask what they got, and they got those from the US, the UK, and Russia. And so the question sort of center around 2 points. One, that is the war and Ukraine's experience with the Budapest Memorandum not a signal to pretty much every other country that the only thing that matters is if you have nuclear weapons? And whether or not NATO membership is a way, quick NATO membership for Ukraine is a way to establish non-proliferation, which is, I think, probably and arguably in the end in everybody's interest. So I don't know who wants to start there, but that's the kind of theme of the Budapest Memorandum and proliferation and what it all means for the future. Ambassador Freed.
Well, the experience of the Budapest Memorandum demonstrates that Ukraine cannot rely on unenforceable and vague security guarantees, whether from Russia or anybody else. The Ukrainians will point out that they're not going down that same road again. And fair enough. I agree with Professor Lanoszka that rather than an abstract debate about NATO membership, it's important to help Ukraine win the war and do the best it can possibly do on the battlefield. All the problems shift in the right direction if Ukraine is winning. Okay, so let's just stipulate that. But we do need to give thought to a longer term arrangement. And for a very long time, most Western Europeans and most Americans believed that some kind of neutrality was the future for Ukraine. And many Ukrainians believed that also. But that's no longer plausible. Russia denies the existence of an independent Ukraine. They've gone to war and have been at war for several years trying to eradicate the Ukrainian nation. So either we arrange some kind of peredishka, a breathing space for Russia to regroup and resume the war at a time and under circumstances of its choosing, or we start thinking about more durable arrangements, which are a lot better than the Budapest Memorandum. So that can be shown as a kind of exhibit A for why general and unenforceable security arrangements are not adequate.
I would add that the Budapest Memorandum is the product of a particular moment in history when many European governments and the United States, for that matter, not really care much about Ukraine, and their chief worry was trying to put the nuclear genie back into the bottle in the context of the post-Soviet Russian Federation and all the aftermath that attended the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine decision makers knew that they were signing on to a bad deal, but they felt like they had no choice precisely because they were trying to earn international recognition. It was also a time when the nuclear proliferation treaty was up for renewal. And so Ukraine certainly did not want to look out of step out of those particular norms. Thankfully, we've moved on from that world in the sense that right now, there's much stronger support for Ukraine than ever before. I think that support is durable. And I think we're seeing that in the various bilateral security agreements struck between multiple countries and Ukraine, including Poland, just today. Those agreements are very useful because they're functional and they go beyond simply the paper pledges that characterize the Budapest Memorandum. They promise a lot of defense industrial cooperation, some of which is already being realized. And as such, they will certainly help Ukraine, maybe not necessarily win the current war, but certainly prevail over the longer term. In other words, I think people already are thinking rightly about the long-term strategic outlook and how Ukraine fits into that picture. I think the bilateral security agreements are a good step in that direction. I would not dismiss them nor cast them as some sort of Budapest Memorandum 2.0. Of course, they fall short of an alliance commitment. They're not an alliance, but they do contain a lot of provisions regarding functional cooperation that will rebound to Ukraine's benefit for the foreseeable future.
I completely agree with that. I haven't read the entire, I've just gone through very quickly the Polish-Ukrainian agreement that was just signed, but it's serious business. And absolutely right. In 1994, the Ukrainians themselves didn't know where they belonged. They might have ended up accepting a kind of neutral status, but Russia got greedy. I mean, that's another story. It is Russia's arrogance and aggression which has crystallized Ukrainian national sentiment in favor of Europe, which was not necessarily, that might not have been the case, but here we are.
Okay, so following up on the security agreements, we have a question about Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And while there's concern that Article 5 precludes Ukraine from joining NATO now, there have been some reports that Ukraine's neighbors, Baltic nations, Poland, aren't confident that Article 5 will protect them in the event Ukraine is defeated and Putin continues with his goal of reconstituting the Russian Empire. You could add also that, I mean, Article 5 can be tested also without Ukraine's defeat as another, possible front that Russia would want to open. So I guess the question is, we hear that NATO guarantees are ironclad, and we certainly hope they are as one of the allies. But to what extent is this war and the West's response to this war in any way testing that the ironcladness of the NATO alliance, and perhaps also in the context of what may be a second Trump presidency? So I'll ask perhaps the Ambassador Fried to comment first.
Well, President Trump has raised questions about his understanding of and commitment to NATO's collective defense commitment. He has said that if a country isn't spending the agreed level of 2% of GDP on defense, Putin can do whatever the hell he wants, which is a Trump way of trying to get the West Europeans, particularly the Germans, to spend more. But it may suggest to Vladimir Putin that time is on his side, and if he simply waits long enough, he will have a friend in the White House and NATO may weaken. Now, it is also possible, and I'm getting some sense of this from Trump world, that Trump may prefer to take credit for the increase in defense spending on the part of European NATO members. Canada is a sad exception, okay, but that's not the subject this evening. It is possible that Trump could take credit for saving NATO. That's an ugly way of putting it, and it's not accurate, because the West Europeans are spending more on defense, not because Trump is yelling at them, but because Putin is threatening them. But politics is not an art for the purist. If that's what Trump decides to do, it's better than the alternative, which is the US pulling back from NATO. In any event, no matter who wins the US elections, the Europeans need to spend more on defense. That's for sure. But there is no way for the US to simply say to the Europeans that they have to be completely responsible for the defense and deal with Russia on their own because we have bigger fish to fry in Asia. That's nonsense. We can actually do more than one thing at the same time. And it is not a sign of US failure that we play a leading role in European security. That was a deliberate policy. We complain about the Germans not spending enough on defense. Well, true enough, and I complain too. But wasn't it us who taught the Germans to be, quote, good Germans? In other words, not militarist? So, yes, the Germans ought to spend more. I entirely agree. And the Poles are now worried that the Germans don't have a strong enough defense, which is pretty astonishing given history. But we ought to understand that the United States is going to play a leading role in European defense, and it should. Europe is not a parasite. A transatlantic alliance is good for the United States. It's good for Canada, and we ought not to knock it. Anyway, I think that if there is a second Trump administration, you're going to see debates along these lines. of how much the Europeans should do, what the American role is. I think our Polish friends are going to play a role because they are spending a lot on defense, are committed to Ukraine, and have at least some political capital with Trump world that they can use and have been using.
I admire the ambassador's fortitude in keeping tabs on Trump world. I could not do that myself, but it must be difficult. At any rate, I think the question speaks to a core issue that the Ukrainian leadership needs to be mindful of. Even if you're in an alliance, your security problems do not go away. And it's, of course, better to be within an alliance than without. And unfortunately, the events of today provide an extremely graphic lesson in that observation. But the fact of the matter is, if Ukraine were to join NATO, it would still be concerned about whether certain allies, or all of the alliance for that matter, would truly have its back in any sort of armed crisis involving Russia. Those concerns will not go away. And we see that in sharp relief in Warsaw and in the various Baltic capitals, countries that are most attuned to the threat posed by Russia. So, in other words, regardless of how the NATO membership question resolves itself in this decade or next, Ukraine will have to do well to fortify itself and to be as self-reliant as possible. Well, of course, having various network connections within the alliance to boost functional cooperation of the sort we already discussed, but do so in a way that is mindful that at the end of the day, Ukraine probably will have to rely only on itself.
Along the theme of NATO allies having to spend more on defense, I'm sure most people on the call are aware that Canada not only has not met its NATO spending commitment, but doesn't have as yet a plan to do so. And so and indeed is one of, I think, perhaps the only ally that doesn't have a plan for when it will reach its 2% of GDP spending. So the question is, as a Canadian, I'm concerned that Canada has underspent on defense for several decades. Will it take the surfacing of a Russian submarine in James Bay to galvanize public support for Canada to meet its 2% GDP target, which is, actually moving quite quickly to higher targets? So the 2%, which was the commitment, is now being viewed more and more by allies as a floor and not the actual target that's necessary. So I think, because it's a Canadian themed question, I would ask Dr. Lanoszka to start.
Unfortunately, I'm skeptical whether it will move the needle that much. Right now, we're seeing debate unfold in this country about potential members of parliament being willingly and wittingly in collusion with foreign governments. And the government does not really seem to be interested in disclosing the identity of those MPs, and there does not seem to be significant public pressure for the identity or identities of those MPs to be revealed. That might seem to betray a lack of maturity in thinking through very difficult security subjects. I think the problem starts with the political leadership that we have in this country. It's just not comfortable thinking about global politics, and I hesitate to use the word realpolitik, but in fairly sober, clear-minded terms that recognize that there are bad faith actors out there that would be willing to harm Canadian interests without much regard. So I'm not sure what the solution is. I think events like this one are very helpful for improving geopolitical literacy. I think there needs to be more of it in this country. And I certainly encouraged efforts in this regard. I'm involved with one with Bilingual Réseau d'Analyse Stratégique. But these are small steps. I think the problem is very, very big. There needs to be some sort of mental shift in the Canadian body politic. The good news is that Canada actually has a pretty proud history of thinking things through militarily and strategically, considering what we've done in the mid-20th century and even before, or even more recently than that. But we are in some sort of crisis point in Canadian politics where we're very blithe about the threats that are lurking close by.
Thank you, Ambassador Fried. If anything to add?
Well, I would not comment, and I'm not competent to comment on internal Canadian political dynamics. But let us say, I wish the Ukrainian Canadian community all the best in making its points, which I suspect would be ones I would endorse.
Indeed, I think you would, Ambassador Fried. We are now at an hour into our webinar, and that's the time we've allotted. So unfortunately, we are running out of time very quickly. Just from myself, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us today to listen, and to our two speakers, Ambassador Fried and Dr. Lanoszka. Very interesting and very timely discussion as always. And I would like to ask Alexandra Chyczij, our president, to have the final remarks for tonight's evening. Alexandra.
So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to thank our speakers. And Ambassador Fried, I agree with your earlier point that the global community lost an early opportunity to secure victory in the early stages of this war. But as you said, we are where we are. So I take great comfort in your hint to us that a bridge is certainly code for more that NATO can do to help Ukraine. And Professor Lanoszka, I certainly hope that the government of Canada, whichever party leads the government now or later, will rely on your expertise in crafting a Canadian defense policy that is good for Canada and good for Ukraine. Because right now, those two go hand in hand. Any spending on Ukraine helps Canada reach that elusive 2% of GDP goal. And I also just want to thank our participants this evening, our audience. The UCC regularly advocates on behalf of Canadian and Ukrainian interests with the government of Canada, and that includes speaking to cabinet ministers about the need for Canada to meet its 2% of GDP goal. And our briefs on that topic are available on our website, or you can reach out to our office, to Orist at ucc.ca, who can share those with you. We also issue calls to action to our community with requests that they contact their members of parliament on various issues. And this one in particular, members of parliament are always galvanized when their constituents reach out to them. So on that note, thank you to everyone, and we wish you a good evening.
Thank you very much. Just one final item for our participants. Tomorrow and in the coming next few days, there will be rallies and demonstrations organized in several communities across Canada. So do please check UCC's social media where we will be posting times, places, and dates for those events. And please do come out to join us. And with that, дуже дякую всім. Thank you And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Слава Україні.
Героям слава.